A ship in harbour is safe, but that is not what ships are built for. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion today is Sri Lanka's current economic challenges, global as well as here domestic. To discuss all this and more, we've invited four guests to our studios this evening as well. Let me quickly introduce them to you. Joining us this evening on the show are Dhananath Fernando, Chief Operating Officer of Advocata Institute, Dr. Brahm Nicholas, Economist, Anushan Kapilan, Lead Economist, Verity Research, as well as Dr. Rohantha Athukorala, Vice Chairman of the World Rural Tourism Council. To pose questions from our panelists this evening, on to my immediate right is Nireshali Thambi, our Consultant Director at Newsfirst, as well as on to my immediate left is independent journalist Shia Ranis. You too can join in the conversation. The number to send in your messages via WhatsApp is 076-656-5353. Make your questions brief as possible so I can pose them directly to our panelists this evening as well. So let's get the ball rolling today with Dhananath Fernando, Chief Operating Officer of the Advocata Institute. Good evening, Dhananath. Nice to have you on the show.
Nice to be back when you're back.
Always nice to have you as well on the show, Dhananath. Dhananath, recently Minister of Aviation Bimal Ratnayaka, speaking about the new addition to the Sri Lankan fleet, said that he had a tear in his eye when he saw the new addition coming to Sri Lankan Airlines. I want to ask you as an economist, did you have happy tears or sad tears? Your time starts now.
I had happy tears and sad tears both, because on the social conversation there were people who are believing that the Sri Lankan Airlines has to be reformed. That's my happy tears. My sad tears were also, there was another side that people were quite overwhelmed and they still believe that we have to the taxpayer money has to be spent on protecting the national airline. But I would like to bring facts into this scenario. The truth is, the case for the feasibility of Sri Lankan Airlines financially is no longer valid, because we have incurred we have lost about $200 million just by trying to buy planes and taking a bribe for about $16 million. I mean, if you recall, I think December last year, there was a travel ban by US for few individuals, and one was the former CEO of Sri Lankan Airlines for taking a bribe on this Airbus deal. And the expected bribe was 16 million. What he got was only $2 million. But in that process on cancellation, everything costed for 200 million. And that is only the loss. Additionally, the treasury absorbed about 500 million. And that's where my sad tears comes, because this is no longer feasible. What brings happiness is the need for transformation. There is a conversation, there has been an attempt. There was not a single bidder. The only solution, because people ask solutions, we all know how difficult the situation on Sri Lankan Airlines. I think the only solution is we have to absorb the debt, which is, in other words, getting the burden on the taxpayer. Second, we have to absorb the accumulated previous losses. That will also add burden on taxpayers, and then we have to bring an investor and cover some of the losses, and then from the taxes, because if you convert it and bring a new investor and a new buyer, then we can ask them to pay the 30% corporate tax from day one. So you have to cover the loss over a period of time, and I think we have invested quite a lot of money. It is not about anything against the Sri Lankan Airlines staff or the pilots or anything. It is completely the feasibility and the competitiveness on this global business context.
Right. So, Dhananath, based on what Bimal Ratnayaka told in Parliament, he said that the new lease of the aircraft is costing the Sri Lankan government $270,000 US a month, while the losses accumulated because of the Airbus deal that you spoke about is around $800,000 US. Now, this is a stark difference in terms of what Sri Lankans have to pay back in terms of making sure that the Sri Lankan Airlines sustain itself. In your opinion, do you think Sri Lankan Airlines should be restructured or at least should be sold to a foreign bidder? Because at the end of the day, you can survive without an airline.
No, 100%. Restructuring is a must. What is the structure of the restructuring is probably what we have to debate. I am not saying, I mean, if we can give it to a private investor or another buyer, that's fine. Or else, because of the complexity of this airline business, because it's a national carrier, I think we have some routes coming under the national carrier. So if we, even like what we had the management contract with Emirates, if we can move to something in that sort, even that is beneficial. So I think in terms of restructuring, I think there's probably the unanimous consent on restructuring, but the formation can be discussed. But by trying to keep it under the government, probably government is taking a back foot on their promise on anti-corruption. Because when you are trying to keep it under the government hands, you are basically incentivizing corruption, and you can see it. I'm not saying it's only coming from the government end, because a lot of private companies who have sort of a monopolistic agreement with Sri Lankan Airlines, and I think they want to keep it under the state purview because their businesses are getting benefit.
So what if I told you that a company that is making losses is paying increments to its employees? How do you view it, Dhananath?
Absolutely. So this is the corruption that I mentioned before. When you keep it under the government, because you really do not have an incentive to make it profitable, because you are running the business by taxpayer money. But also there's a political economy that we need to understand, because the moment that you absorb the debt, I saw the conversation. Okay, Sri Lankan Airlines has started making operational profit. They make operational profit because they absorbed $500 million to the balance sheet, and $500 million is equivalent to the controversial Millennium Challenge Corporation agreement, which covered public transport, land reforms and traffic, which is basically affecting common man. I mean, whether it is right or wrong, it's a different discussion. But even if we had that money without MCC to do it, probably we could have given a try. So that's where we have to evaluate the real economic benefits on the Sri Lankan Airlines matter. The more that you keep it under state purview, there is no way that we can rescue. I think we have tried it. I mean, we have brought the best business people as chairpersons of this company, but it's all about the competitiveness that we need to speak about. If you compare Emirates, who have been running it till 2008, declared a bonus of 22 weeks for their employees this year. So that's where the game goes on, and that's why I do not recommend. I think it's not the role of the government to do business, especially a business like airlines, because which is very competitive, and even the private sector is struggling. Most of the airlines are loss making, and even like Emirates or Qatar can do it because they have deep pockets to run it. But Sri Lankan Airlines, it's quite difficult. Especially when you are coming out from a debt restructuring, you really do not have the deep pockets to invest, and without investing you cannot revive the airline.
Right. So I'm just trying to figure out, Dhananath, the IMF has imposed a lot of conditions. One of the conditions is, we know from the grapevine that increasing electricity tariff was on the agenda, and as such today the PUSL has already agreed upon to increase the tariff by 15%. I'm not talking about electricity alone. I'm talking about the restructuring of state-owned enterprises. Why isn't it that this notion is on the agenda of the IMF? Why can't they tell the government, get rid of it or restructure it or do something for the benefit of the people, because you're continuing to bleed? Why isn't this conversation taking place at the IMF board level?
That is what the same messaging that we have been telling, Shamir. IMF brings stability. So as long as you move with cost reflective pricing on electricity, you are stable. But that won't bring growth. What brings growth? You have to bring the cost down. To bring the cost down, you have to do the state-owned enterprises reform. So on the IMF conditionality, they have brought the measures which only bring stability. The state-owned enterprises restructuring is not as a condition, but if you look at their governance diagnostic report, which is not a conditionality, one of the main recommendations was to bring all the state-owned enterprises under a one holding company, which in my view is, I mean, it's a good step to begin with, but it is not adequate, but at least we can start from there. So that's why, that's the difference between stability and growth. But
that is not being discussed at any fora, because if you look at it, right now the final tranche of the IMF is going to come in. If you increase electricity tariff, that is a conversation that is taking place at an economic forum at the moment. But why isn't the SOE restructuring coming into the process? Because we saw the manner in which how a group of intellectuals, economists got together during the Ranil Wickremesinghe administration to restructure SOEs. Now that is defunct completely. So I'm trying to understand, coming from an end of an economist, why are we still holding on to organizations which are bleeding?
So on the IMF front, it's as I mentioned, it's not a conditionality, because for stability that is not required. But that's why I said the stability can be brought by IMF to an extent, but the growth has to be done by ourselves, and the government has to do it. And that is there are three scenarios that I predict. First is a takeoff scenario, not the aircraft but the economy. Second is a drifting scenario, where you slowly drift from the reforms, and you basically, you go to the habits of the hearts. And then third one is relapse.
Right.
So what I see is, by delaying these state-owned enterprises reforms, we are drifting from a takeoff hope by people on anti-corruption, and really, there's a new political conversation about a new political culture. I see there are drifting from that takeoff scenario to probably to a drifting and a relapse if we move in this direction.
So I can safely say, Dhananath, 80% of your tears were sad tears, and around 20% a little bit more optimistic.
Sometimes when you get both tears, you get confused.
Right. So you are confused at the moment. Nice to hear that, Dhananath. So we'll try to entangle this confusion as the show goes along. I want to now switch to Dr. Brahm Nicholas, who's an economist as well. Dr. Brahm, just to understand now, I recollect a couple of months ago when you were on the show, you were talking about money printing, and this also stabilizes the country's economy, and you were of the opinion that the money printing is not going to bring inflation to excessive levels. But again, I saw recently Dhananath, in fact, having a show on social media, spoke about how money printing has stopped inflation in the country, and how it has contributed for the betterment as far as the country's economic stability is concerned. Have you changed your thoughts on this?
No, definitely not.
Okay.
Because I keep pointing to the same things until people actually start listening and also looking at these things, critically evaluating them. We have littered in the advanced countries, policymakers, academics, all saying the same thing now, that we have actually learned the wrong type of economics for way too long. And one prominent example there is Federal Reserve Chair Powell, Mr. Powell, and he's actually said 2 years ago it was, that the economics that he learned, which is printing money causes inflation, is wrong. And it's actually not the way that modern economies work anymore. And he has the backing of evidence where we have a period from 2009 to 2021 where the US went on a money printing binge. Now, where was the inflation during that period? We should have seen prices rise by 600%. Instead, we saw prices rise by about 50% over that period. So the models were wrong. And the models are based on this understanding that it's printing money that causes inflation. The academics are starting to wake up in the advanced countries. The policymakers have already woken up, because if they get it wrong, it's disaster for their economies. The only ones that don't seem to have woken up yet are, I think, the policymakers and academics in Sri Lanka, who keep on going with this same argument. Yet they can't show me any evidence, because, in fact, if we look at the research done by the central bank itself, they say that it was not printing money that actually caused the inflation in 2022 and 2023, but that it was mainly driven by supply-side factors. We're talking of the exchange rate collapsing, commodity prices globally rising, and supply chain issues throughout the world, which was causing inflationary pressures everywhere. So I keep pointing to these documents and to all these examples, but to my despair, I don't think anyone is actually addressing this, but keeps on just going with this mantra, no, we learned this in school, it must be true. But where's the examination of
So
the
we'll grill you further, Dr. Brahm, as we go along, because Dhananath is also here. Dr. Dhananath said that it was in his show that he spoke about inflation and growth stability. So you can have evidence from him in a bit momentarily, and then you all can beg to differ on your thoughts. But Dr. Brahm, for me to just understand, how do you view the country's economy progressing now as we speak? Because right now we know that the economy is just sailing. I started off saying a ship's mandate is not to stay in the harbor, but to go out there and do its task. So I'm trying to figure out what is the government's mentality right now in terms of the country's economy. How do you view it?
And I thought that was a perfect metaphor, actually, because it's my view, and I think if I'm hearing people in the business community, they're echoing the same thing in one form or another. I think the problem at the moment is that policymakers and academics alike in Sri Lanka have been distracted by all the wrong things. And sad to say, it's also happened here now when we started the show. Sorry for being rude about this, but discussions of SOE reform, of corruption, of increasing tax revenue. Even though I would not neglect these issues, I think it's missing the wood for the trees, and it's not going to get that ship out of the harbor. And 4 years long we can keep discussing these types of things, SOE reform, corruption, what we're going to do about that. But I guarantee you, even if you solve those things, it's not going to move that ship out of the harbor. And now, when you guys asked me again onto this program, I almost considered sending just a recording, because I keep saying the same thing over and over again, which is until Sri Lanka actually starts adopting industrial policy to industrialize Sri Lanka, I don't think that ship is going anywhere. And I say this now with even more confidence, because we're in a world where everyone seems to be waking up to the importance of manufacturing for a dynamic economy. And I'm not just talking about Trump, because I would also disagree with a lot of the policies that Trump has recently implemented. But we should not dismiss his underlying argument, because it's something that President Biden before him was also adhering to. And that is that there is something in particular about the manufacturing sector that is crucial for any dynamic economy. And Biden knew it and implemented all these subsidies for strategic industries within manufacturing that he wanted to promote. Trump is taking a whole different approach with these tariffs, which I don't think are going to work, but both of them are saying the same thing. If you neglect manufacturing, your economy is going to grind down to a halt. And that's what they're fearing right now. They're seeing this decline of living standards in the US. They're seeing this decline of their technological superiority, losing out to China. And there's actually one very interesting presentation that Vice President J.D. Vance gave a couple of months ago. I think he words it a bit better than Trump can do, but what he said was the problem has been the shifting of production out of the US to China and other Asian countries. And he says, we thought we could keep innovation within the country. We thought we didn't need the production, and especially the lower value-added production. But what happened? China started moving up that value chain. And the whole world discovered, including these US companies, that where production is, R&D and innovation also eventually take place. And so what he was saying is, this is actually why, economy-wide, the US is now having a problem, is because they moved manufacturing out of the country, thinking that they could prosper still as an economy as they used to do. But you see now that Trump realizes that they need to bring manufacturing back. Biden before him, even Obama recognized this. But his head of economic council actually disagreed with him, because she was trained with the textbook economics, where you should not interfere in the market. You should just let it do what it does. And we view basically the manufacturing of a semiconductor chip as the same as a haircut. This is what she was arguing.
So, Dr. Brahm, very quickly on this manufacturing and these policies that you're talking about, we saw how in 2008, because at that time I was in the US as well, in 2008, the economic crisis, the General Motors was almost bankrupt. The US government had to come up with a bailout plan to resurrect the company in question, because there were so much of people who are dependent on General Motors at that time. And we saw how Barack Obama came on board and put a bailout package, all that and more. And that was the time that General Motors was manufacturing in the US. And now you're talking about manufacturing moving out of the US and being established wherever, it may be China or Vietnam or wherever it is. I'm just trying to figure out what is the comparison in both of these notions, because at the end of the day in 2008 they collapsed because of General Motors, almost collapsed because of General Motors, and now we're talking about manufacturing being taken elsewhere.
Actually, by that time, General Motors had already shifted most of its production out of the country to Mexico.
But we know in 2008 there was a huge bailout plan that was given by the Obama administration to resurrect General Motors, and he went down in history as one of the presidents who really put in money where his mouth was.
I'm not sure that was necessary, because basically what he did was try to revive a company that was no longer competitive. And this is how brutal capitalism is.
So aren't you going to be competitive when you go and make something in China or somewhere else? Because when you say China, the notion that people get is it's all bad products, but that's not the case. Look at the cars that are coming in now from China. They are the number one in the world. Why not resort for manufacturing in other parts of the world if they are being very competitive in nature?
Yeah, so it's very good for China, but it's not so good for the US, is it?
We'll talk about all this, Dr. Brahm.
But sorry, before we move on, just one thing that Obama also did in 2009 is give Tesla a huge grant and a huge loan as well to set up their production.
But now that love affair is a bit is under a lot of strain.
But where would Tesla be without that loan?
Right.
That is the question.
So we'll come back to all this, Dr. Brahm, as we go along. And my attention now is towards Anushan Kapilan, lead economist of Verity Research. Anushan, now we all know last year was deemed as one of the best years for Sri Lanka in the last 5 years, if you take into account. We saw how the growth levels really went up more than 5%, and it was deemed as a year that should be given credit to the Ranil Wickremesinghe administration. I'm trying to figure out this year, the growth rates are coming down. The World Bank had already predicted it's going to be less than 3% or in the range of 3%. As someone who is an expert in public finances, how do you view this situation for Sri Lanka moving forward in this year?
Okay, thank you, Shamir, for having me in the show. It's a pleasure to be here. So yes, in terms of the growth of the country, we saw that in the last, what we saw was right after the crisis, we had negative growth in the country. And the GDP was negative in 2022, and we saw, what we saw really in 2024 was that the growth increased to 5%, which was actually much higher than what was expected. So there was IMF projections even which said that the growth will be around 2 to 3% during 2024. But we overshot on that target and we reached a 5% growth. But when we look at the reasons why that's happening is also because the country's growth was down because of the crisis. And if we really look at the growth, we have still not reached the 2018 levels. The 2018 real GDP levels are still, there's a difference of around 5.8%, which we still need to reach to get to the 2018 level. So we have not gotten to that position yet. So what we actually saw in these last year was actually a rebound of the growth. So the growth in many sectors actually increased, and most sectors have bounced back to 2018 levels.
Tourism is one such example.
Tourism, yes, and most of the services increased, but there's these sectors such as construction and industries, which are still much below the 2018 levels. And we see that they also need to start pick up in this year. And we also see that probably this year can also be similar to a year in 2024 because the economy is in a right position, but I'm not sure whether we will reach the 5% growth that we had in 2024 for this year. And again, when we look at growth, it's what really needs to be looked at is the long-term growth. The 2024 was a short-term rebound, but the conditions should be necessary in order to get to the long-term growth. But
we know, Anushan, that we saw Dr. Harshadi Silva saying that capital expenditure of the government has been very slow this year. How do you view this contributing to the country's economic growth in the short, medium and the long term?
Yes, actually that is one of the things that I wanted to come into, because capital expenditure, which was around 5 to 6% before the crisis that we had, has actually dropped to around 2.7% in the last year. So which is a very big dip, and we really think capital expenditure, because when you look at growth in general, what really drives growth, because the theories, the economic theories, mainly one of the main determinants of growth, the main determinant itself is based on the Solow models, is capital, investment in capital. So capital should come from private sector or it should come from public sector. And what we really see in the last few years was public sector investments have been really low. And even the government this year has budgeted that it will reach a 4% capital expenditure. But we really have to see, because that really depends on government's performance. Because every year, even last year, the government had a higher capital expenditure in the budget. It expected around 1.3 trillion in the budget, but it only actually spent around 800 million rupees. So there was a shortfall. So we'll have to really see how the government manages the budget this year to determine if it will reach the...
What happens if they don't spend this money? Is it going to be a plus for the country's economy, or is it going to be in the medium and the short, long term, a minus for the country's economy?
If it does not invest in the capital expenditure, you mean?
In the next few months, if it doesn't happen at the same pace that we predict it to happen?
So that's what we see, right? Like, because these capital expenditures are mostly affect the long-term growth of the country, because you have in the past, like we are actually getting use of all the capital expenditure, the roads and everything which was built in the last 5 years. And when you see such roads, or not only just roads, but like important capital infrastructure developments are not being taken into, not being invested, we would see eventually in the next 5 years or in the 10 years, the growth will eventually start coming down. So we really need to, because in the last 3 years we have not invested. So we really need to catch up to that. So investing in that capital expenditure is key, but we also have to be careful, because investments in unfeasible capital expenditure shouldn't happen like what we did in the past. It has
so
to
return on investment is key.
Return on investment is key.
Right. Thanks a lot, Anushan Kapilan, lead economist of Verity Research. I now move my attention towards Dr. Rohantha Athukorala, Vice Chairman of the World's Rural Tourism Council. Now, Rohantha, you were also a member of the Sri Lanka Tourism Board at one point. For the viewers to understand, how important is it to have a national carrier? Because it's not about numbers. For those who are watching the show tonight, they might think that it's not about numbers, it's about showcasing what Sri Lanka can offer, what Sri Lanka has to offer. All this and more is going to come if you have a national airline. This has been under a lot of contention at the moment. I want to understand from you, as someone who has been very thoroughly involved and engaged in tourism for many, many years, how do you view this development taking place at Sri Lankan Airlines at this moment of time?
Shamir, it all depends on how you look at the overall game plan of tourism. The logic being is that you might have a promotional campaign where you drive the tourism brand globally, and then you would also want to know as to how the experience of a consumer at different touch points could be consistent, and that is when the airline comes to play. So if there's a traveler coming down from the UK and you have Sri Lankan Airlines who will be taking that traveler from the time that person checks in, it's that same consistent hospitality that you would experience. And then of course you would also have a situation where you would use the airline as a competitive advantage for the nation. I'll give you a classic example. When I went for the KOTFA exhibition in Korea, I went and met up with the at that time I was chairman of Sri Lanka Tourism. I went and met the CEO of Korean Airlines, and he was like stunned. He said, "This is the first time a chairman of Sri Lanka Tourism has come to meet me, first time." So I said, "I want to understand from you, is there any best practice that we can pick up?" So he cited Maldives. What they're saying is that Maldives has marketed the destination so strongly into South Korea. They came and spoke to the Korean Airlines and said, "Can you do your scheduling of the aircraft in such a way so that you have 80% of the travelers who come to Maldives is honeymooners." So they had certain times that they would get married and they would avoid extra cost in South Korea. The airline picks up around 6 o'clock a particular traveler, and by 6 in the morning you are at Male.
Yeah, so I just want to understand, Rohantha, you made a very valid point. In the case of South Korea doing it, I totally understand. But does Maldives have an airline?
See,
they are trying to depict themselves as a tourism hub. So almost all the travelers who are coming mostly from Dubai, they have a touchdown in Maldives, like Emirates or even Qatar for that matter.
Yeah.
So Turkish Airlines, for also an example, they all touch down in Maldives because Maldives is known as a tourism hub. But does Maldives have a airline? They don't.
See,
they don't have a national airline.
You're right.
And they are doing extremely well in terms of tourism.
You're right. See, it depends on, that's what I said, it's a perspective that you have. Maldives.
But must Sri Lanka have an airline? Now that's the biggest question mark.
See, I mean, if you look at most of the tourists that come into Sri Lanka, you will see that as soon as the certain sectors in the Western Europe was stopped around 2.5–3 years back, you suddenly have a dent on the tourists coming into Sri Lanka. So what the research shows is that if you have the logistical airline linked to the Sri Lankan tourism brand, it has a competitive advantage.
No, as how? Just because, Rohantha, I just want to understand now, this is being a big question mark right throughout about why Sri Lankan Airlines is making losses for that matter. Let's take a look at every time you travel to Melbourne or you try to go to London, the flights are fully booked, and even the staff question journalists like me, "Sir, I don't know how the airline is going at a loss. Every time you travel, it's packed." And must we sustain an airline like that?
See,
something is going wrong somewhere. We are not talking about Mihin Lanka. What a disaster that was. Just because of an ego of one person, that brand was built, and that was a total disaster. I don't want to mention names, but this is what Sri Lanka is all about. Isn't this also an egocentric exercise to sustain a bleeding airline? Mustn't this, as the Dhananath always mentioned, mustn't this be restructured at least now? This is the time. Let the people bite that hard pill. Let them swallow that hard pill. Let them do it. Mustn't we do it? See, bite the bullet and do it.
These are two different discussions, Shamir. So from a brand perspective, like I was telling you, Maldives cannot afford an airline, which is why they tied up with South Korea. But in case to Sri Lanka, we have a definite advantage in terms of having as a brand extension. But in terms of the profitability, Well, the question is that how come Emirates made a profit, while as soon as Sri Lankan Airlines took over, that we started making a loss, and it's the same destination.
Yeah, but the reason there is, Rohantha, because when you have multiple airlines working in a particular sector, that airline is bound to make profits because you have multiple destinations that is being catered to, and it goes as a codeshare airline.
Yeah.
This is my basic understanding about airlines and how it operates. So the reason why Sri Lankan Airlines went at a loss immediately after Emirates withdrew, probably is this the reason. This could be the reason.
See, Shamir, I'm not an airline expert, but all I'm saying is, as a business, in terms of how you manage your demand chain and your supply chain, and how do you make sure that you remain profitable, is the kind of challenge that is held. Now, a lot of people combine the ground handling operations plus the catering, and then as an entity, they would make money. And in most circumstances, you have the airlines making a loss. But then, you know, these are the kinds of strategic decisions that one will have to make.
Right.
But as a tourism perspective, I would strongly put my hand up for having one's airline, because it definitely enhances the overall proposition
So
to the
we
consumer.
are talking about, let's talk about India for an example, Rohantha. Tell me the national carrier that India has.
Well,
Air
yeah,
India was now owned by Tatas.
yeah, but
And they have ordered almost 1,000 Airbuses from Airbus, and they are running perfectly well. And today, if you look at Tatas, they are doing very well with Air India. It's going at a very turbulent time in terms of the restructuring process, because people are not used to being looked after by a private entity rather than a government. But does India have an airline?
see, Shamil, these are the
But
kinds
Sri Lanka
of
have one.
You're right.
That's the fourth largest economy in the world today.
See, I think what is important right now is to assess the current situation and take some serious, drastic decisions. And I think that's
Yes
what
or no for airlines?
I would put my hand up from a branding perspective. But
No,
the
economic
point is,
perspective.
the point is, Shamir, that this is where
Take
strategic-
your marketing hat off for the Rohantha and tell me,
no,
are you for an airline or are you not for an airline?
see, my view.
Don't be diplomatic, Rohantha.
No, my view, Shamir, is that I hear you, but what I'm saying is that we have to take some serious decisions, because see, if you don't have your overall plan in the tourism sector not right, then you going and getting into the logistical framework, it means that you're not looking at your core business.
My point is, Rohantha, I was told by many who are working in Sri Lankan Airlines that they've been paid an increment of 6%. Why am I paying my tax money on a company that is bleeding to pay 6% increment just like that?
Two separate discussions.
No, I'm asking you, why must I do that?
Yeah, we should not, because
Right,
it's, I mean, end of the day, if you don't pay for somebody else's inefficiency.
Right,
But
thank
I would focus on the core
Yeah,
proposition.
we will come back to that Rohantha momentarily. But as I said before, I don't want anyone's tax money being utilized
Yeah.
to run an entity which is inefficient. Right, so now I want to open the floor for questions from Nivesh and Shihar. But again, one question, please. I promised you after this I'll let you all handle this. Dhananath, one of the important points that Brahm made in his remarks was that there are certain economists who are misguided by this theory of money printing. I think he's directly pointing the finger at you, because you have been very vocal on social media about inflation and money printing and all that. Do you want to answer Brahm, or you want to, in your metaphoric terms, you want to leave that and let the ball slide?
No, I want to answer.
Yeah.
And first of all, I wish Brahm very well, and I wish that I'm wrong. If money printing doesn't cause inflation, I would be the happiest, because then this conversation is over. Let's print as much as money as possible. Let's give the 6% increment to Sri Lankan Airlines. Let's increase the Astra Summa by like 200%. Let's do whatever, everything which is possible. And I wish him all the well, and for him to be right, and for me to be wrong. But unfortunately, Shamir, your experience and my experience, a lot of Sri Lankans' experience wasn't the same. Even when Jeremy Powell made this comment in 2021, if you look at what happened to US inflation afterwards, since you mentioned, I wasn't aware that you have been in US, inflation went up to about 7% and then 9%. And US inflation at 9% is not a joke. And in Sri Lanka, I mean, since you mentioned about statistics, I'm not sure for which camera that I should.
Just turn it.
Yeah.
That's fine.
So this is in 2021 January. So this shows the money, like the government holding of, I mean the CBSL holding of the government securities, which is the indication of the money printing. So in 2021 January, we had about approximately about 900 billion worth of treasury bills and treasury bonds, which increased to almost about 300 billion in 2022 December. And do I need to remind what happened to inflation during that time? And do I need to remind for Sri Lankans what happened to the currency during that time? From going from 180 to 360, inflation hitting 70%. And even in the US case, it may not be proportionate to, I mean, money, because US is it's a reserve currency. Not only the US is using dollars, we use dollars. Everyone else uses dollars. So you really cannot compare US money printing versus our money printing, but it was indicated statistically on what happened to inflation. And I'm saying, I wish for me to be, I would love to be wrong.
Listen to Dr. Brahm as well. Dr. Brahm, now Dhananath makes a very valid point. There was a time, I remember, in Sri Lanka, people were taking money on interest from banks at 26% and investing that money at treasury bills and bonds at 34%. Do you remember that time? Do you remember? I know a lot of people who did that because they were borrowing at 26% from banks and investing those money at 34% at treasury bills and treasury bonds at that time in 2022, this the bankruptcy time that we're talking about. And then he speaks about the US currency is a generic currency all across the world. However much you print money, there won't be any inflation as such. Tell me one country that has printed money and has done well. So for our viewers to put this case to rest, tell me one country in the world that has printed money and there was no inflation. Just one country, and then I will leave my case to rest.
It's every country. Because what actually is the
Which
case?
country?
Every country.
Every country?
And we can't say that
Is India printing?
So we can't say that the US is different from Sri Lanka, but then also say, but look at 2022, they printed and there was inflation. So is it or isn't it the same? So if we're now accepting that both these countries and all countries function the same, they have a central bank, they have monetary policy, they have money, and they have prices, then they generally function the same. And that is what now academics and policymakers are saying. They don't deny that there's correlation between printing and prices, but let me ask you this: what happens when prices rise in the economy due to costs rising? Companies and banks need more cash in circulation because prices are now higher. So the central bank is actually forced to print money and accommodate that demand of the market.
So what happened to
that
countries
correlation
like Venezuela,
is there.
for an example?
Sorry?
What happened to countries like Venezuela, for an example? What is your thinking about Venezuela?
So the sequence is always the other way around, and you can see it in the data, and I challenge anyone to look at the data. We talk of Zimbabwe, Venezuela, the Weimar Republic, US, Sri Lanka, it doesn't matter what. I offer this challenge. You show me that inflation moves after the printing, I will concede straight away. But what we always see is that the inflation moves before the printing. This is what we have shown time and time again.
So
how do you explain that?
I'm not going to ask Dhananath's opinion now, but I'm just going to cross to Anushan on his views. Do you think money printing is causing inflation, or do you think money printing does not cause inflation?
Okay, what the basic economic theory is that like when you have too much money and too few resources, it's basically you're going to have inflation go up. The prices are going to go up because let's say all of us, we have, let's say 100,000, and then suddenly we print another 100,000, and we have 200,000, and we only have like 2 products here. So you see that common sense that the prices of those 2 products are going to go up. But I also understand that there are sometimes theories which is suggested based on US as an example.
But can US be taken as an example, because the US currency, however much you print, is available across the world, wherever you go. Now take Iran for an example. Iran is a sanctioned country, but when you go with US dollars, they trade. I went to Russia. I have been to Iran as well. I've been to Russia a couple of months ago after these sanctions were issued. They trade in USD terms as well. They are not handling currency from foreigners through rubles. So the currency, even though there are sanctioned countries, they work on US dollars. Take Libya for an example. I've seen in markets Libya carrying trucks in these bulldozers and taking it to other places. So I've seen this happening.
Yeah, so what really then at that point matters is the demand and supply. So, okay, US prints so much money, but then they also have so much of demand for their currency all over the world. So, because the demand matches, you won't see much of an effect. But when you look at a country like Sri Lanka, which is a small country, and when we start sometimes printing more and more currency, what happens is that in the country you get a much bigger pool of money, and then it also affects our exchange rate in a way, because there is only very few dollars available in the market, and the Sri Lankan rupees, you have a lot more rupee. So then again, one of the main causes of like exchange rate skyrocketing to that high levels, which also led to high inflation during 2022, was having a lot of money in the market.
So,
when the market has
so Dr. Brahm, I
moved
just want to pick your brain on this just one last time, just to understand. So I've been doing a little bit of travel over the years, and 2017 I was in Iran, and I was left with a bit of Iranian currency, and I thought I can take it out of Iran and try to exchange it somewhere else, because it was quite a handful of money, because of inflation in Iran, $100 meant you had to carry 2 bags. So I took 1 bag back, which is around $50, to Dubai to try and exchange, and then they told me, because Iran is a sanctioned country, they are not able to exchange that currency. So I left that to rest, and then came 2022. I tried traveling with some Sri Lankan currency overseas, and they told me because Sri Lanka has printed so much of money, they can't exchange the money that I was carrying in 2022. So at the end of the day, I felt at that time that because of the issues relating to money printing in Sri Lanka by the central bank governor at that time, had caused to all this problem that we are facing at present. So one final question to you is, do you still believe that money printing does not cause inflation?
Of course, because you now have offered as a defense that the US is unique. But what about Japan then? They printed so much money between 2009 and 2021, and they were even fighting deflation. So we can keep going on and on about these isolated incidents where we say, look, there was inflation and there was printing, and I'm not going to look at any other period in history, nor any other country, just the data that suits my purposes. Yet, shouldn't we be looking at all history? Because we see even in Sri Lanka,
largest economy in the world.
But we see even in Sri Lanka, when
largest economy,
even
if they grow by 1% or 2%, that is economic growth.
Yeah, but we see even in Sri Lanka.
Look at China. China is not recording economic growth over 10%. It's always this. It's a single-digit growth in China as well, being such a large economy.
Yeah.
So they are doing well.
Yeah. So what's the point?
So my point is, you're talking about Japan.
Yeah.
Japan is the 5th largest economy. They can afford to print however much money they want.
Where's the theory that says that they can print but developing countries can't? That theory doesn't exist, and it isn't in the textbooks either. And this is what I keep referring back to, is we have a theoretical problem and it can't be solved.
Right. Anyway,
unless you view printing in a very
topic
different way.
to rest at the moment. Let the people decide. There are very well learned individuals who are watching the show, usually face the nation, so I'm pretty sure they will be able to make a wise decision as to whether money printing is going to cause inflation or not.
Dhananath, how many state-owned enterprises do we have? Does anyone even know?
I don't think anyone knows. We have a list of 527.
527.
That's including subsidiaries and sub-subsidiaries of state-owned enterprises and some of the statutory bodies as well.
Right. So,
Government says it's, I think they released data on 52 and there was a conversation about another 200, but I think I can confidently say no one really knows.
So the government doesn't even really know how many state-owned enterprises it has. Right. A few of these are profitable.
Yeah.
So certainly carry on with those. Okay. If you have a company, it's profitable, no harm. Right. But the vast majority are not profitable. Now, some of these are essential. Let's take the CEB, the CPC, the bus transport, those are essential, fine. Whether they are profitable or running at a loss, we need them. The public needs them, the country needs them, fine. But then you get the non-essential and the absolutely unessential. 529 SOEs, I think that perhaps 400 of those we don't really need. So if some of them are profitable, fine, but most of that would be not profitable. Why are we keeping these at a time when we can't afford it? We can't. I mean, are we out of the woods yet?
Definitely we are not out of the woods, and
are we even close to being out of the woods? Just because we have petrol in the petrol sheds, we are not out of the woods.
Yeah, so the economy has reached to a stable level, but definitely we are not out of the woods, number one. And even, Niresh, I would like to go one step further. I think some state-owned enterprises are profitable, which is good. But profitability should not be the only indicator of evaluating of whether the government should do it or not. Because some of those SOEs are monopolies. So if you are a monopoly, if you still make a making a profit should not be a big criterion, because you are the only seller in the market. So people are, they have no other choice. So in that sense, our view has been government has a role of, I'm sorry, I have to use a cricket metaphor. They have the role of the umpire, because when the umpire starts playing the game, what happens.
Not the match fixer.
Not the match fixer. So what now the government does is they come, they umpire, and next moment they go and try to bat. Then they take the ball out from the bowler, and then they want.
They're trying to do everything.
They are trying to do everything. And now
but everyone is confused.
Against? Like my tears, now you are confused whether umpire is bowling or batting or umpiring or fielding, or whether he's a third umpire or the match fixer or the match referee.
No, but who are they playing against?
They are playing with everyone, mainly with public money. That's the only thing that I can say. But I will give you a classic example. Now, let's take the helicopter service. Now, since we spoke about tourism, if you are a high-end tourist, probably it makes sense to travel in a helicopter from here to Jaffna or wherever, if you have the pockets to spend. Now, the main helicopter service has been offered by Sri Lanka Air Force. Now, let's say Rohantha and I wanted to start a helicopter service. Definitely we cannot compete with Sri Lanka Air Force, because Air Force pilots are being paid taxpayer money. No offense to them. Their helicopters have been bought by taxpayer money, and the fuel probably they can get on credit from CPC, and they are not paying a single cent of taxes. But when Rohantha and I wanted to start a heli tour, I have to pay the commercial rates for our pilots, I have to source fuel, I have to buy helicopters on like I have to access a bank loan, and I have to pay an interest. So of course when I'm pricing the ticket, my prices will be quite higher than the Air Force ticket pricing. But the government earns nothing, and taxpayer money has been utilized for helicopter service, and who gets the benefit? People who can afford a heli tour, which is the taxpayers' money being spent on a heli tour. Imagine if Rohantha and I run this service, not only as a monopoly, others should join, but we have to pay 30% taxes to the government. So that's why I say government has No reason, because on all the businesses, even what Shamir does and everybody else does, they have a 30% share whether we like it or not. Without doing anything, we have to pay 30% taxes. And that is additionally to VAT of about 15%. And that is additionally, if you have an employee who earns more than 150,000, you have to pay a pay tax on top of it. And you have a tax mechanism all over. And what even government, I mean, they are not even coming to collect the money, that we have to go by ourselves and deposit the money on their account. So government easily takes 30% on profit. On revenue, they take VAT. So it's almost more than 50%. So I do not see a reason. That's what I said. Just because it makes profit doesn't mean that the government should stay in that business. You have to evaluate the broader picture. Because Shamir, you cannot say we need to have entrepreneurs at the same time and say the government should do business. Because as I said, when the Air Force runs the heli tour, you are basically discouraging two entrepreneurs who really want to run a airline.
But technically, Dhananath, there are two other private companies who are operating heli tours in Sri Lanka. So they must be doing well, or they must be doing some jugglery. Is that what
No, they must be doing well. But I meant was, look at their context, that they are in a quite a disadvantageous position, because when your taxpayers spending money on something else, and when you have to run on a commercial basis, it's the same. I mean, it's same for the hotel industry. Imagine the government runs a hotel. I mean, they will bring people, I don't know, from wherever. And if the treasury extends credit for them, and if they're not extending the same credit for the private sector people, I mean, how are you going to bear the interest cost? So that's why I say you cannot say the same tagline, saying we need more entrepreneurs, and at the same time saying the government should do business, because that's contradicting. You cannot, if the government is on, I mean, if they are doing the business, you're basically squeezing the space for the same private entrepreneurs. But again, having said that, it doesn't mean the government should be out of the equation. They should regulate whenever which is necessary. They should play the role of the umpire and make sure that the players play according to the rules of according to the rules of the game, and that's their mandate. And that is something that the private sector cannot do. I mean, we cannot come and regulate all the players. It has to be the role by the government. But the problem is, now the roles have been mixed up. Umpire thinks that he has, I mean, it's like, umpire thinks I want to be a Kumar Sangakkara, and he, takes the bat and he wants to show that he can hit sixes. And you asking Kumar Sangakkara to come and, can you umpire or like coach I mean, it doesn't work. He is good at something, umpire is good at something, and we have confused the roles.
So, Dinesh, you said that CEB, no, wait, I want to ask you a question very quickly. You said the CEB is a government institute or private, because now they just increased 15%. Last year they made 15 billion profit. A little bit confused I am.
I think the CEB is confused, and it's confusing the rest of us. But yes, they had a massive profit. I think we addressed this a couple of weeks ago, and they are increasing. But just one more thing, sure.
Yeah.
Now, you pointed to this your description of the umpire trying to do everything. And you also spoke about the Air Force running heli tours or helicopter charters or whatever. Now, the Air Force was set up by Act of Parliament, and it's called the Air Force Act or something like that. Do you think that this running commercial helicopter businesses is part of that Air Force Act?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
But I think they do it.
So again,
no offense to them, but I think exactly that's what I said, the confusion of the roles, because it brings a governance problem on the other side, and it also brings a lot of confusion on the private sector side. I mean, that's the same thing that I mentioned, because everybody try to do everything, and it's really confusing. And I'm sure
I think there was the time the army was selling vegetables.
The same problem. And even I think a lot of, even on the if you look at key areas for tourism like Nuvareli, I think there are a lot of holiday bungalows being done by some of the state-owned enterprises, and they try to rent it out, and you are basically distorting all the market signals, because you are taking away someone else's opportunity, because someone's public money has been invested, and you are basically blocking an entrepreneur, and that's one reason why Sri Lanka is not progressing. I mean, we have been having this conversation for too long, but every time, I mean, 80% of the land is owned by the government. There are 527 state-owned enterprises. Government is trying to do everything, like from salt to eggs to from airlines to electricity, everything you are trying to do everything. And there was a saying, if you try to grip all, you lose all. And that's exactly what is happening. On, let's say, on the tourism, I think Rohantha spoke about the importance of a value proposition. Government has a fund. Okay, let's say if we need an airline to promote tourism, government has a, which Rohantha spoke at the last show. I mean, we have money on our kitty for spending, to spend to the global tourism campaign for how long? I mean, the money is there. You cannot spend the money, you cannot, in the sense, the campaign has not been finalized. So, I mean, if you really want to promote tourism, there's money, there are different activities that you can do to do it. And I think the real problem is the government trying to do everything. I think government has a bigger role. I want to reiterate my message, and they has to be strictly on the governance front, and especially on the rule of law.
Now, every government which comes to office tells us that they are going to evaluate the SOEs. All the SOEs they will evaluate and see whether they need to be closed down, whether they need to be privatized, restructured, whatever. But then we don't see a lot of transparency in this. The government just says, no, we are going to keep this, we are going to sell this. There's no real transparency, because we need to know, we are the owners, the public, we own these godforsaken enterprises, but we don't know why they are being kept. There are SOEs which, you know, you wouldn't even understand what in the world they are there for.
Niresh, I have a slightly different view for what you said, whether the public owns it. I really do not believe, I mean, on paper public owns it, but actually it is owned by a handful of elitist, politically connected business people. I mean, public, I mean, what...
All the more reason to get rid of those things.
So it is portrayed as public owns it. In Sinhala, there was a saying, in the front of the lorry, it says Budu Saranai. But actually, at the back, you are transporting cattle for beef. So, Isara Budu Saranai kela gahala, passe harak patona. So, it's the same thing. You say it's owned by the public, but actually, it is owned by few connected, politically connected business people, and that's what I said. Even on a lot of these SOEs, because of that benefit, they are not willing to transfer it. I mean, the real transfer to the public would be listing at the Colombo Stock Exchange. Then anyone can, buy shares, get dividends, get the capital gains, transfer the shares, and earn money. Anyone make it a publicly listed company, and then you have better transparency on financial accounts. And people can buy it, if that's the case. And that would be the real public ownership, not like only very few people owning it and claiming that is to be owned by the public. That is not been the case, which was proven by on multiple state-owned enterprises cases. One reason, I remember one of the CEOs was saying that on Sri Lankan Airlines, one of the main problems for them to make losses is all the politicians are calling and saying, okay, can you increase my baggage allowance? Can you give me an upgrade? How can you run an airline when, not a housewife who is going to Qatar or Dubai or wherever cannot call and say, I public owns this, can you give me an upgrade from the economic class to the business class? It can only be done by a connected, politically connected person. That's what I said. It is not owned by the public. It is portrayed as owned by the public, but these are only owned by very few politically connected elitist few individuals.
Brahm, we are almost 3 years after the economic crisis started, right? Now still we are in recovery process, but we are not fully out of wood, right, as Dhananath said. But how concerned are we about another default? And what are the preventive action we need to do from now onwards? Because we have to start repaying our loans, external foreign debts from 2028, right? And we need to build up our reserve to $14 billion from where we are now, somewhere around 6.5 to 6.6 billion dollars, right? And we only have less than 3 years. How concerned are you, and what are the preventive measures we have to do to prevent another default?
I'm quite concerned because my problem is, as I stated at the beginning of the show, that I think we're all distracted. And you actually said a key word there. You said foreign payments, because this is the distraction that I'm seeing, is everyone is now treating this as a general debt problem. The IMF has treated it like a general debt problem and says the only way that Sri Lanka can sustainably recover is by increasing tax revenue and controlling the general budget. Nowhere in there is there any addressing of the issue that happened in the first place, which is that we defaulted on our external debt because we ran out of dollars. It wasn't because there was this budget deficit going on and that there was too low tax revenue, even though I would say that that was also causing problems. But this issue is far bigger and nothing seems to be done about it, because if I look at the policies that the new government has come up with, I don't see that much difference with the previous government, and I don't see any deviation from what the IMF is recommending. So a lot of focus is still on general debt management. A lot of focus is still on the budget deficit and on increasing tax revenue. But where is the plan to actually transform the Sri Lankan economy into a foreign exchange earning machine? Because we're now back to where we were before. We're focused on tourism earnings and on foreign remittances. Where did that lead us? Twice. We saw the disaster in 2018 and then after COVID. And so my concern is very great, because I don't think we've even identified the problem correctly. I think everyone is distracted and talking about a totally different problem that, for me, is missing the point. And what I would like to see is more focus on this foreign exchange earning capability that Sri Lanka should be building, and quite frankly looking at the only solution that I have seen throughout history and across various geographies, which is moving down the manufacturing line. If we look at the successful East Asian countries, they all shifted into manufactured exports. If we look at the countries that have the worst external crises, like Sri Lanka had in Africa, they all mainly produce agricultural goods, low value-added manufactured goods, and other raw materials. They haven't moved down that manufacturing line. And then we have countries that focus on tourism as well, but we don't see them going anywhere. The only solution we have seen throughout history is export-oriented industrialization. But, I keep going on and on about it, but I don't think anyone is actually paying attention, because we're perfectly happy going back to what was done before and didn't work.
Anushan, would you like to comment on that? I mean, how concerned are you on another possible default? And also, Rohantha, how about the tourism now? I mean, are we getting the real, foreign inflows? I mean, expected foreign inflows? Because this year, I think they have targeted $5 billion, which is so ambitious, right? You can answer that after Anushan.
Okay. So having a default is really concerning, and we saw what happened in the crisis, right? And when we looked at, in a way, what he says is right, because we did not have foreign exchange earnings to pay back on our debt, which has to be paid because our reserves have almost bottomed out at that point, and we did not have the foreign exchange to pay for it. So it's very important to improve our external position in terms of increasing the exports of the country. But we also see just that alone wouldn't also fix the issues, because we also need to have the fiscal, the debt sustainable, right? Like, because Sri Lanka ran into an unsustainable debt. And what happened was these foreign investors who were giving us money, the ISB holders, they realized that Sri Lanka is not going to pay back their money, and they just stopped giving money to us at that point. And and all of that, so it's just foreign investors in that, but then there are also domestic investors. When they see it's risky and when the debt is going at a very high level, they would also ask for higher interest rates from the government. So it's really important to ensure that the deficit is well under control, and ensure that like the revenues are built in a way that we do not make a lot of budget deficit. So going forward, that is very crucial, and it's a very important thing, and we should not let the default happen again.
See, Shyam, thanks for the question. Very interesting question. See, when a company is in trouble, you have to take drastic decisions, and we know that we are in trouble from the discussion which we heard right now, even up to 2028. So this is where you have to take serious decisions. So if you take your key industry, tourism, currently, you know, we have to understand that 99% of that industry happens to be private sector led. So whatever that's happening right now is organic in nature. So we are having about a 14.7% I think GDP growth in terms of number of visitors coming in, while in terms of revenue it's about a 10.2% growth. So now the question is that is not going to help us in terms of getting us out of trouble for the country. So this is where very strong policy decisions have to be taken in terms of asking, you know, what is that distinctive position you want your tourism brand to be, and then making sure that you deliver that. Now on the 26th of June, the new nation branding campaign is to be launched, and you know, one key thing that's going to come out is, even just around the 4-5 of us around this table, half of us will say it's a brilliant campaign, and another half is going to say it's a terrible campaign. So we saw this even when it came to Incredible India when it was launched. You know, half the country said, you know, how can you say Incredible India when, you know, things are so bad on the streets? But it's one of the most powerful campaigns the world has seen, and successive governments have tried to change it. They couldn't get that top spot, you know, box tick off, and ultimately they had to continue with the same campaign. So I think we need to support the industry on the 26th. We got to see as to how we can take this thought across to the rest of the world, so that we are also part of the brand building process. So I would say that shift is going to happen on the 26th, and we got to wait and see as to how the whole campaign is going to roll out. Currently, you're right what you said. I mean, the country is looking at a 3 million tourists coming in and a 5 billion, and research is showing right now that there might be a gap between about a 3 to 4 lakhs. They will fall short, and also in terms of numbers it might be about almost 500 million. So that analysis is on the table right now, and it's been discussed in different conversations. So I mean, we have India, Russia, you know, that gives in about 175,000 visitors who are coming right now, but we find that UK has slipped to the 3rd position, and we know that a typical UK traveller is the one who comes and stays for 8 to 10 days, and the typical Indian traveller is maybe 3 to 4 days, you know. So so there has to be a conscious effort as to how we're going to look at segments of people that we want to bring in here. How are we going to make sure that the campaign drives it, and these kinds of very strategic decisions is going to help us to actually shape the industry. And
so Rohantha,
just one question. Why are we so hung up on this statistic of arrivals? Because it doesn't really mean anything. I mean, it's not the arrivals, it's the number of days they spend and what they spend on. If they're going to just lie on a beach for 8 days, there's not much point. You could have 10 million tourists lying on the beach for 8 days it doesn't.
Yeah, but they
you
have
know.
to eat,
Yeah,
fish.
but then if they go around and see the cultural sites and go shopping and
But
whatever,
I think
But
No, Niresh, your point is
what
valid.
what is the indicator?
indicator.
Shouldn't it be the amount of money spent?
Yeah, I mean, the typical traveler between a Maldivian and a Sri Lankan traveler, I mean, one would pay about $167 a day here on the clientele that we attract, while a nation like what I mentioned does about $350, $400. So, Niresh, the answer to your question, we've been waiting for 15 years for this campaign, so at least now I feel that it's our duty to support and to see how we can up the game to $200 tourists coming in, see whether we can change the, I mean, all this time we are all seen as this, seasonality. But the fact of the matter is seasonality is because maybe 30 years back you had the western tourism coming in, but right now you have the eastern tourists coming. So you have to take away that positioning that there is no seasonality.
No, but the point that Niresh is trying to articulate is, Rohantha, the tourists that are coming to Sri Lanka are not spenders. Why? I'll tell you a classic example. Let's take a look at Greece. A 3-star hotel in Greece is going at approximately 140 to 175 euros a night. Sri Lanka, a 5-star hotel right now, if you go to booking.com and check, in Colombo, is at $90. Which sort of tourists are we attracting?
So when you have 1% occupancy on a top resort in Colombo, 1% occupancy, you drop the price to $60. so we saw this 2-3 months back. So
isn't the tourism board supposed to intervene and at least have a ceiling on the prices? Because this has been discussed on this very table over and over again about 3-star hotels having at this rate, 5-star hotels having at this rate, 5-star and above having this rate. We've spoken about this, and most of the hoteliers are against this as well.
See,
they are saying it has to be competitive.
Shamir, I wouldn't, I mean, coming from a brand marketing perspective, I wouldn't ever try to have a ceiling on a brand. I would say let consumers decide how much they're going to pay for me based on the kind of proposition I give. So I would always go for free market pricing. But your point is so valid. The decision that we are in right now is that we need some policy interventions to change the shape of the tourism industry. And if you don't do that, we'll find that the industry is not going to be profitable enough for someone to
stay. Yeah. So Dhananath, Rohantha spoke about the tourism promotion that is supposed to be going on. The tea industry has approximately around 3 billion, and they have not done a global campaign. There was 400 million Sri Lankan rupees spent on a campaign that didn't even start. They had just paid the money to a advertising agency. How is that, Dhananath?
This is the challenge every time, as you can see. I'm not saying it is all the problem is with the government, but when you have too many stakeholders and when the government tries to do it, it delays the process. But I think in this case, I mean, there's a valid side to it, because the government cannot move that fast because without having that proper procurement process and all that, otherwise the money will go again on the corruption direction. But I think the point is on...
But the is 400 million rupees.
Exactly. So
someone has definitely swindled that money.
Correct.
Where is that campaign?
No, absolutely. So this has been the case, Shamir, as we all know, for so many years, and that is the delay on tourism, on tea, and on many thriving sectors. But I think we need to look at the bigger picture on tourism. I also pretty much echoes what Rohantha said. I mean, we should not have a price ceiling, because if you look at tourist spending, they are basically coming for the night and then they spend on laundry and other facilities, going for other restaurants, and that's where their spending comes. So by just having a price ceiling on the room may not giving the opportunity to the hotel to earn from other facilities at the same time. So that's why we should not have that pricing, but it's a different.
So I want to grab Brahm's view on SOE restructuring. Now I recollect in 2011 there was an expropriation act that was brought in to Parliament to acquire 12 state-owned enterprises, and among those 12 state-owned enterprises that was acquired from the private sector in 2012 was a Sevanagala and the Palvatta sugar companies. And when I looked at it in a snapshot, Daily Mirror had reported that the company had not paid taxes in 2023 and 2024 to the amount of 1 billion rupees. Now just imagine if a private sector company does this. Now for a classic example, we saw recently an individual who was embroiled with the central bank bond controversy was being given a prison sentence of 6 months for not paying VAT. What sort of a action must we take if taxes are not paid between 2023 and 2024 by 2 state-owned enterprises? Who should be held responsible?
I am tempted to give you the same answer as I did at the beginning. For me, it's not an irrelevant discussion, but for me it requires context. Otherwise, what are we really talking about?
I'm telling you why, because the IMF had very clearly articulated that the anti-corruption slogan, the anti-corruption rhetoric in Sri Lanka has to really take center stage. This is in their diagnostic as well. They very clearly state that laws have to be formulated in terms of anti-corruption. There can't be corruption in a country where that's surviving out of a bankruptcy. All this is mentioned. Now, this is the context that I'm asking. If the state has not paid taxes between 2023 and 2024, and if they have made a profit under the guise of not paying taxes amounting to 1 billion Sri Lankan rupees to the government, who should be held accountable and responsible? Is it the state or is it the individuals who are running those organizations?
Probably the individuals, but why I gave you my initial answer is because I like to view it in the context of what are other countries doing with these issues. Now, if we agree for a moment that Vietnam is, say, on the correct path, is doing better than Sri Lanka in terms of the economy, and if we say that China is also doing much better, are we really saying that they don't have any SOEs, that they have solved corruption altogether? Is there any measure of corruption that we have where we can say, okay, in Vietnam they've brought it all under control, in China they've brought it all under control, and in Sri Lanka it's still rampant, and that's why we're seeing the difference in performance? I don't think we can, and we have so many examples of successful SOEs in these countries. Take for instance China and the car market. Still, among the biggest car makers in China are 4 massive SOEs. Now, I'm not advocating for the government running companies in competitive sectors, but I'm saying this discussion requires context where we acknowledge that just these blanket statements of, oh, they should never be SOEs and there should never be any corruption, where is that going to get us? I don't think it's going to get us anywhere unless we place it in context of an industrialization strategy, where we say, look, Vietnam, to my knowledge, hasn't solved this problem. In fact, the other day when I was in Vietnam, I was talking to a friend who is running a textile factory there. And he said, my God, with every single application that I have to do with the government, there's corruption involved. He has to pay bribes. Otherwise, it's going to take forever to get things done. So to my knowledge, corruption has not been solved there. And there are very successful SOEs.
So you mentioned about Vietnam, Brahm. So what I did was I quickly went to the internet at my fingertips, and I typed Vietnam corruption ease of doing index. So I just checked the Transparency International figures. Sri Lanka is ranked 121 amongst 180 countries. Do you know where Vietnam is placed?
Probably a bit. Is it higher is less corruption?
Yes, higher.
I'm guessing higher.
Yeah. 30.
Yeah.
So what's the comparison you're making with Vietnam and Sri Lanka?
So how are they measuring this? Because I bet you my friend's example is nowhere to be found in there.
I'm just telling you about corruption and the ease of doing a business, and this is from Trading Economics of Transparency International.
I know this, but
there is less corruption in Vietnam than in Sri Lanka. So don't you think the problem that Sri Lanka has to address at this moment of time is corruption.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think it's actually a symptom of an economy that is sick. And that is my problem, is the cause is not being addressed. Because what you actually see in countries where corruption eventually subsides is a dynamic private sector that takes over and starts giving the incentives and the remuneration that previously were captured by these corrupt sources. And so rather than saying that's the cause of all the issues that we have in the economy, I would call it more a symptom. And this index, I really don't know, but I doubt very much that they can with certainty say this is our measure of corruption.
But this is what the global measurement is. Transparency International ease of doing business is usually
But let me give you an example. They were around 30 a couple of years ago when they found that this woman had siphoned money out of this bank worth 5% of GDP. Did you not hear of this case?
No,
so this case is still going on.
She got a very stiff prison sentence.
Yeah, but how long was that going on? So that was going on for at least 10 years, and that index was very high during those 10 years. So
let's not forget,
how accurate
Brahm,
is that for measuring corruption?
Let's not forget, there was $900 million dollars swindled from the Bangladeshi Central Bank in Philippines, amounting $900 million dollars, and this was a significant amount. This was done by one person, so this 5%. I'm not surprised if it happened over a period of 10 days. This only happened within a couple of hours on a weekend in Bangladesh. So I'm not surprised with these numbers that are coming up, but I am talking about corruption alone. Now this government has come into play to fight corruption. So don't you think this is the problem that is faced by Sri Lanka? This is a pandemic. Wherever you go. Now look at today what we heard. A former health minister's maid has been arrested by the Bribery Commission of Sri Lanka. What does it show? What does it show? It shows corruption is embedded in the bloods of some of our politicians.
And I don't doubt it, but like I said, I think the cause there is the lack of a dynamic private sector. And so what you get then is a government sector that is bloated, that we know. There are way too many people working in government that we can't say is very efficient, and there is a lot of corruption because there's an increasingly smaller pie.
Is it a problem in your opinion or not? Because you're saying
corruption.
Yeah, corruption is endemic to countries like this, but is it a problem, yes or no?
Of course it is, and if I could solve it tomorrow, I would. But I think you're living in fairy tale land if you think that this can ever be solved.
But that
because
is where
even
the government has got a
countries,
mandate. That is why this government has got a mandate. Let's not forget.
I know that, yeah.
You know, let's not forget that 6.8 million people went to vote at the general elections in Sri Lanka and appointed 159 members to parliament to fight this problem.
True.
People like Rohantha, people like Dhananath have been on this show before and have spoken about how important it is to fight corruption. That is a problem in Sri Lanka.
Yeah, but now
Anushan was talking about return on investment. Right? Tell me what is the Nelum Kuluna that has been spent $400 million doing? Tell me.
Sorry, can you repeat?
The $400 million investment of the Nelum Kuluna in Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
What is it doing?
No, so that's why I said I don't disagree that this is a problem that needs solving.
What is the Hampampura National Convention Center, International Convention Center doing?
Nothing much. Yeah.
This is the problem.
No, because I disagree with the cause. And that's why we have a disagreement here.
Can I?
No, I don't have any opinion.
No. Can I ask a related
question? I'm trying to be as
question?
independent as possible. I'm just asking people's problem.
Can I ask a related question? But Dana also can, pitch into this. Now, this government came into power by saying that they are going to eliminate or eradicate corruption. Now, corruption has its own value, right? We don't know the cost of corruption in Sri Lanka, right? Whether it's 50 billion, 500 billion or 5 trillion, right? Now we see kind of a positive perception about that the government is so serious about, tackling the corruption, right? We have seen arrests, we have seen like raids in, this Department of Motor Traffic and, some other government institutions, and people are being arrested, right? We have seen this. Now, what if people, get frustrated that these anti-corruption measures are not being translated to their own benefit? Now, if the corruption is reduced, people should see, their living cost of living should come down. There should be a saving for them, or they should earn more. If one of these three things are not going to happen, they are going to get frustrated in sometimes. They might be happy about all the arrests, but they are going to get frustrated. How do you see this?
I see two main issues. One is, in my view, corruption is a byproduct. So when you have the wrong economic setup, corruption automatically takes place. That's step one. And as you very correctly said, now people have high hopes. Okay, we're trying to bring down the corruption, and if the corruption doesn't really translate to economic prosperity and economic growth, two things can happen. As we all agree, people can get frustrated, and that will bring the popularity down of the government on one side. And the second thing is, the government will confuse, and they will try to retain into power without realizing what's going on, because now we are driving something anti-corruption, but it really doesn't translate into economic prosperity. So they will get confused and try so many things, and maybe that's where the drift comes from, to slightly from democratic to undemocratic, not only in Sri Lanka, in any parts of the world. That where would be the real test that would come out. So that's what I say, the reason for Sri Lanka's economic crisis, I think my chairman Murtuza said it a few weeks ago, it is more a policy problem, because when you have the wrong policy, you basically incentivize corruption. At the same time, that's what I said, I agree there's corruption in the private sector, but when you have too much discretionary power given to one official, and look at what has happened with what is going at the moment on releasing the convicted prisoners on the Vesak Day. So you have the power vested on one individual. So even while the courts has given an order, you have the consent from one authority which can be twisted. So the corruption takes place in the process. Those are the two scenarios. But I would also like to comment on two things on Brahm said. I 100% agree with him on this industrialization and developing the industries. Who said no to that? Everyone said yes, let's do production, manufacturing. But the problem is not on agreeing whether we need to do manufacturing or not. The problem is whether we have the ecosystem to do manufacturing. 90% of our industrial zones are occupied. So where the manufacturing is going to come from? BOI, one-stop shop, is one more stop all the time. So where the investment is going to come for this production? So the real problems are there. And if the state is going to do it, it is not possible. Yeah, and I disagree with some of the stats. With one second on Vietnam. I mean, look at the privatizations that the Vietnam had done through Doi Moi reforms. They have even done energy sector reforms like PV gas, petrolemics, even the banking sector. There's so much reforms which was done in Vietnam and even in South Korea. And the ecosystem has been transformed. So I agree with Brahm on we have to do for industrialization. But the ecosystem has to be...
No, but what I'm trying to understand is, Brahm, now you say that the US economy, the underlying concept or the thinking of Donald Trump is good. He wants everything to be US made, right? And he wants manufacturing to start in the US. Then what about countries like Sri Lanka? If US starts manufacturing everything in their home soil, what about the other nations? What about the other countries?
So he doesn't care.
No, yeah, but now let's take a look at, now if we are to export something to the US, let's take apparel for an example. If they start manufacturing apparel in the US, what is going to happen to countries like Sri Lanka?
First of all, the argument that full capacity has been reached has been used many times before. So they did it with China, and they said now that China is manufacturing everything, there's no space for anyone else. Along comes Vietnam and proves them wrong. With Sri Lanka, such a tiny country with a tiny economy, do you really think that the US, even if it does manage to bring manufacturing back to a certain extent, which I don't think is possible with the current policy framework, but even if it does, there will be plenty of space for Sri Lanka to find those niche markets where it can excel.
Yeah, but we know, Brahm. I've been to the US a couple of times, and I'm telling you this with experience. In 2007, when I was in the US doing a CNN fellowship, George W. Bush announced that they are going to stop all imports from China. You know how long it lasted?
Very short.
Very, very short.
Yeah.
Look at what Trump did with regard to tariffs with China. Ultimately, what happened?
It lasted very short.
So, where does your argument hold?
No, I'm saying the same thing. I'm saying that they can't achieve it with the current policies that they have. But the underlying philosophy is correct. They have to bring manufacturing back. But whether they can is another question entirely.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, you have to walk the talk. Now, I'll tell you a classic example. Sri Lanka was looking at bringing down Starlink. Ranil Wickremesinghe met Elon Musk overseas. They spoke about bringing Starlink to Sri Lanka. Guess who capitalized on that investment opportunity? Bangladesh. 25th of April 2025, they gave granted license to Starlink to start operations. What are we doing? Because it was brought and introduced by a previous regime. This regime does not want to do the right thing.
I don't know. I mean, some have said.
Let me try to ask Dhananath this question. You know, just because someone else does it mean that it's a evil thing to do? Because at the end of the day, it should be the betterment of the public at heart, isn't it?
Absolutely. It was said that if you are not considering who would get the credit, what you can accomplish is incredible. So I think we have to, that's what, I mean, we all have been pretty much saying that the policy consistency have to be there and we have to do what is right. And that's what that as think tanks, we are insisting there's a set of policies that we need to do. I mean, it could be for manufacturing, it could be services, it could be for Starlink, it could be for tourism. You have to integrate with the global markets. There's no other recipe to come out. That's given. And you have to think of the ecosystem, and without doing that you cannot integrate to global supply chains. And as you very correctly said, what George W. Bush said in 2007, and then what Trump did, no country can produce anything 100% on their own soil. That's given. I mean, look at our apparatus, look at what US is doing with their Teslas, or even what is China is doing. I mean, everyone has to trade with each other because we are on a global supply chain. There are about 50-60 countries on producing one good, and what we need to do is get into that supply chain. But here's the trick. Now India has taken massive steps and we are on the receiving end. India has signed a trade agreement with the UK, so our apparel sector, so probably they will get a better advantage on exporting to UK than us. So most likely our apparel sector will shift their production to the UK. And they are at the edge of finalizing another deal with EU. So if that happens, definitely we are going to get affected unless we have some uniqueness on the product manufacturing. So there are two solutions, because at the moment on apparel and certain sectors, India and us contesting for the same export basket. So there are two options. One is we can really think of diversifying our export basket and contest for things that India is not doing if we have the competitive advantage. Option one. Option number two, we can become a part of the India supply chain. So we can become raw material suppliers for India's production. So because otherwise, now already we are having a conversation on GSP plus and we haven't done anything on signing the trade deals, and I'm sure it also may be difficult because when your country is at a default stage, no country taking you seriously for signing a free trade agreement. So on that context, we have to be strategic and look at the overall view, because what is going on China, and today there was a deal between US and China. So it is obvious that no country can survive on their own, and we have to be strategic and linked with the global supply chain. And I'm with Brahm that we have to do it, but bring the labor reforms, bring the state-owned enterprises reforms, because without that, how can you bring the electricity costs down? And with these electricity prices going up, it will come to water, it will come to hotels, it will come for everything. But with a monopoly, you cannot bring the electricity prices down, and that's where my worry comes from on from a takeoff to a drifting and a relapse, because now what we hear on the electricity bill which was approved, now it seems that we are reversing on the reforms that we have already done. So that worries all of us, because if we are going in the wrong direction, our concern on another debt default is becoming faster, because already most of our revenue is going for paying the interest. So that's where the challenge comes.
I just want to ask Anushan a question about this capital expenditure. You spoke about return on investment, and I spoke about Nelum Kulana for an example. What is the investment it's bringing forth to the country? And there was a lot of talk about selling Sri Lankan insurance as well as Sri Lanka Telecom. What are your takes on these?
So state-owned enterprises reforms is a must. I guess we need to know how to reform that, but we also need to be careful of like which ways are we using it to reform, because it also has some of the things has to be looked at case by case basis, because we can't just come to a conclusion that everything has to be privatized at a point, because we need to understand that the government is trying to do I would agree on state-owned enterprise reform sectors. Maybe we need less of the government hand on that, but there are certain things which the government really needs to play a more role, because I know Dhananath earlier mentioned that the
more role means
we have a role of an umpire government, but I think it's a little bit more than that, because in terms of things like health and education. So when we look at the growth of countries worldwide, one of the main drivers of those growth are human capital investments. So those are mostly provided by the government, and we see health and education spending. When the health and education spending of these countries are very high, we see the countries also reaching higher per capita income, and that has been proven in lots of theories that human capital investment is really important. And we see that recently the levels of investment into health and education is at a lower point. Over time it has kind of come down, and it has been at a lower point, and we really need to improve on those things. And we know that the government wanted to increase the education budget to 6% and health budget to 3%. All of those things are needed, and the government needs to invest on that. But I also see like there's a problem in which the government is not able to invest on that, is because the government has a primary expenditure limit of 13%.
Just let me ask, Dhananath, you said that corruption is a byproduct, but I mean, in several regimes in Sri Lanka, was it a byproduct or was it actual policy? Wasn't corruption the policy which those regimes were built around?
No.
And that itself completely stifled industrialization.
It is the policy, but it is that policy is an outcome of trying to keep more and more state control. Now, I'll give you a classic example.
Yeah, but keeping the state control is so that they can have more corruption.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So these, if you look at most of these corruption cases coming under state-owned enterprises. If you can look at the Sri Lankan Airlines case, the 16 million bribe, which we cannot find out yet, but the UK court has already found out. And even most of the cases, even what happened in the bond scam, there was a state bank, there has been a conversation how it was involved. So every time the state-owned enterprises has been used as a vehicle for corruption. And that is how it has been there, even on this case of this carom board case, which has been the Satosa has been used. So every time you can see some connection to state-owned enterprises, because that's how. So that's what I said. When the government keeps more and more control, but I agree with I agree on the fact on health and education. But my point is, when you allocate $500 million to absorb debt, I mean, where are you going to have money to spend on health and health and education? I mean, we have to spend on health and education for sure. No two words about it. But we are spending because you cannot. I mean, there's always a opportunity cost. When you spend it on something unnecessary, you have to cut it down from somewhere. Unfortunately, that has been the case. So, on your point, Niresh, yes, sometimes the policy has been corruption, but the policy became corruption, like on the Strategic Development Act. It is because of again state trying to keep capture and because of the wrong policy framework is my take on this issue.
So when the policy is corruption, in the cricketing parlance that you love, it's umpire hurrah.
Absolutely.
Anushan, now we know that Mahinda Sirivardhana is going to retire and resign as the Treasury Secretary. Who is going to be the next Treasury Secretary? Who should be? Okay, I'm not going to ask you who it is going to be. Who should be, in your opinion, the next Treasury Secretary?
Okay, what qualifications should the next Treasury Secretary have?
Okay, in terms of who, the personality, yes, I have no clue. That's up to the president and the government to decide. But it should be someone who, as qualification, it should be someone who has the knowledge of like economics and need to understand the repercussions of each policy action, right? And also what is important is you should not just make a policy action because that you can make that action, because there's always a trade-off in economics. And that requires a lot of understanding of what
why I'm asking this question was, there was a lot of talk about Mahinda Sirivardhana should be removed from that post by the present government at many political fora before. So this probably comes as a blessings in disguise for the government, because he's resigning to be the alternative director at the Asian Development Bank. So the person who's filling this role has big shoes to fill. As Niresh says, what sort of qualifications must he bring to the table?
That's right. So definitely that person should know the economics behind. So he should have ideally a PhD in economics.
Yeah,
yes.
Okay. Should be from an economic background.
Anushan, we had the same qualification of that nature from 2005 to 2020.
So
Moral fiber, I think, is required more than anything else.
I think so, yeah. It's not the qualification, more than that we need something else.
No, but we also see sometimes the policy decisions can go wrong, and this person should know what should be the repercussion and also to inform the...
So I want to ask Brahm. Brahm, I always want to ask you this question. Today I'm going to ask you this question. In your opinion, tell me what went wrong in the Gotabaya Rajapaksa administration, where Ajitkumar Cabral was the governor of the central bank. In your opinion, what do you think? What went wrong? If money printing was not the issue?
Well, first of all, I think we should acknowledge that they were also saddled with problems that were created by governments that came before them. So the whole ISB borrowing binge came well before Gota came in, and he didn't borrow a single dollar in terms of ISBs.
Yeah, but Ajitkumar Cabral was the first governor who started borrowing from ISBs.
Absolutely.
In 2008.
Absolutely.
Let's not forget that.
No, we should not. And
so ISB borrowing started from his time. So 2020 wouldn't have been that of a difficult task, because he knew exactly what was going on. He was the governor until 2015.
Absolutely.
And there was a lapse of 4 years, and then he became the governor again. So I'm just trying to figure out from you, what do you think went wrong?
Well, so this is the proper diagnosing of the problem that I'm talking about. Is if we start pointing at the fertilizer disaster or the printing of money that went on, the excessively low interest rates, and admittedly the excessively low tax revenue that was there, we're still not going to get any further. So that's not to say that those were all problems and mistakes. It's to say, again, you're missing the wood for the trees. If there had been an export earning machine present, the problems would have been far less, because...
What is different now?
Nothing.
Where is this export earning machine now?
That's why I'm concerned, and that's
I'm asking
the answer
now, right,
that I gave.
What was not there in 2020 What is there now, tell me, will you?
No, I'm saying there's no difference.
Yes, that's the
Yeah.
difference. So there
So we're
was
still,
definite-
still
there was
relying,
definite economic
still
mismanagement.
relying on tourism, still relying on
Yeah, but-
foreign remittances, and we still have a debt overhang, an external debt overhang.
And you said in your remarks now,
Mm.
fertilizer, you said tax reduction, revenue collection, all these were problems, money printing, all these were problems. This is called economic mismanagement, isn't it?
I think the economic mismanagement, the greater mismanagement happened way before that, when there was excessive borrowing of ISBs, which could never
Right.
be repaid
Okay.
with the export
I
earnings that
understand
there
what
were.
you're saying, Brahm.
Yeah.
I'm with you. Let's say I am with you at this, with deed at this time, but I'm trying to figure out what didn't we have at that time? What do we have now? Now we're
Nothing.
doing well. Last year was 5.5% economic growth. We don't have petrol queues anymore. We don't have inflation at crazy levels at 70%, 80%. We are minus inflation at this point of time.
But so this is exactly the point,
What-
right?
what
In
is that now?
2019, Sri Lanka was doing well, wouldn't you say? Was doing well?
2019,
Yeah, was doing well. But I'm saying there was already a problem building there that nobody was looking at. Same today. You say it's going well because there's no petrol queues and that there's stability has
So you are
returned.
saying this might aggravate and we will fall
What has
face
changed?
into
You said
problems
it.
again.
Nothing has changed
So,
because it's
so what do
still
we
reliance.
need? What do we need for the industrialization policy?
How long do we have?
No, I'll give you some time. Don't worry.
Yeah.
We just know. No, we just want to understand because you come from a background
Yeah.
that your thinking has always been money printing is good. 2019 to 2000.
Never said that. We can go back over the recordings, and this is often misunderstood when we say that this is a misunderstanding of how inflation works, that it's not caused by printing.
Yeah,
that
printing
means
money, okay,
printing
okay.
money as much as you want. No, because we're not modern monetary theorists.
Okay, but
We've always maintained this,
But
and
what
our
is-
theory is, in fact, because otherwise, why bother with industrialization if you can just print money and give it to everyone?
right, but what do we need?
You don't need to bother with
What
industrialization.
does Sri Lanka need, briefly?
It
What are the main
needs-
points?
It needs to return to something that looked like what President Premadasa was doing in the 90s, where a lot of incentives were provided to export earners, specifically in manufacturing, that were willing to go down that line. And you had the 200 garments incentive that he gave, but there were also companies like Lodestar that were incredibly successful. Why? Again, because of state support. They got a crucial loan from the NDB at the time at concessional rates to help them to become internationally competitive. And time again, we see the government's hand actually creating this massive transformation that needs to take place in Sri Lanka now and has taken place in all the industrializing countries. We take the example of Taiwan, for instance. Where did TSMC come from? This is now one of the most powerful companies in the world. Everyone is fighting for relations with this company. Where did that come from? It started as a government-owned enterprise, or they owned 48% of that company. So how can we say that government has no role to play in transforming an economy into an industrialized one when we see time and time again it's actually the government that forces this radical change in the economy? Because before, Taiwan was an agricultural economy. Before, Korea was an agricultural economy. They were producing according to their comparative advantage. They were picking their low-hanging fruit, as we like to say in Sri Lanka. But that didn't help them. It was because they actually ignored traditional economics and said, right, we actually need strong industrial policy from the government to incentivize our manufacturers to grow and prosper and move up the value chain as well. It's not just about producing low value added manufacturers, but it's about moving up that value chain.
I just want to understand, Brahm. Now, I asked you a question about what went wrong during Gotabaya Rajapaksa's administration. Let me also ask you what went right during Ranil Wickremesinghe's administration, where he appointed Dr. Nandalal as his governor and continued with that decision.
I'm not sure that much went right.
What is it? Sorry,
I'm not sure much went right during his presidency. Sure, there was a return to normalcy, but can you really tell me that that had to do with government policy and not just time? Because that is what it was. Tourism started coming back, foreign exchange earnings started building up again, and how can we say?
I want to go back. Do you remember in December, the following year, we declared bankruptcy? We had only 500 million US dollars with us. And at that time, we had many intellectuals on this very show from the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, past presidents, who said that this 500 million US dollars should not be paid to ISB holders. We should declare bankruptcy and save this money for fuel and other essential commodities like medicine. However, the then governor, Ajit Nivar Kabral, went ahead and paid this 500 million US dollars, saying that we had money. A few months down the line, we were experiencing power cuts for 16 hours a day. Were you in Sri Lanka at that time? Okay.
I was experiencing those.
You were experiencing it also. We experienced it very bad because we were running an operation in Colombo as well, and it was very difficult to find fuel to run those operations at that time. So the private sector really had to pay the brunt of all that mismanagement at that time, but that's leaving aside. But just to understand, nothing of this sort happened after Sri Lanka declared bankruptcy, and many economists at that time in December, I remember even Advocate Institute, Dhananath Fernando came and said, we are now in the ICU, so we have to at least declare bankruptcy now before it's too late. Let's go for a soft default and start addressing the problems that we have at the moment. All these calls were not heeded, and as a result of that, we went through a very bad patch, and never again we want to experience. When Shihar asked Anushan, are we going to experience another default, my spine really, jitters went down my spine, because we don't want to experience that again.
But I think it's unavoidable at this point, because
Yes, but default does not mean a return to petrol queues and all that.
And you know how many people died? Nearly 7 to 8 people died in petrol queues. Do you remember?
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Because our disagreement is not on how severe that was, but it's on the cause of that
yeah,
problem.
but look at what actions have been taken by the then governor at that time. Printing money excessively. Look at the inflation. Do you recall the inflation?
I think there was a Supreme Court judgment on this mismanagement.
On mismanagement of the country's economy as well. 5 people were accused of mismanaging the country's economy. Were you here at that time, Ram?
Yes, again, I agree with the problem, but not the cause of it
No,
that
but-
you're pointing
Yeah,
to.
what is the cause then? Now, if we had 500, now let's take you for an example, Brahm. You have 50 rupees in your, 100 rupees in your pocket.
Yeah.
You're supposed to survive with this 100 rupees for the next 2 days. Are you going to have a meal for that 100 rupees today, or are you giving it? Are you going to give it to a person who already owes you money?
I think this is moving a bit away from the discussion of what causes
So what is it? No, I'm trying to
inflation in an economy.
Yeah, but why would we take a decision like that? I'm asking you, if
So
you had
there's
only
no
$500 million,
Yeah.
why would the then governor think of paying that 500 million US dollars to ISB holders and not having any money for us?
You would
And
have
when we went to China to ask for money, they refused to give us money.
So that's something I'm not privy to, and I'm also not privy to other relationships that they had with other governments.
Yeah,
where
but you
they
were told
could
that
have
there
had
was
access to
2.7
credit.
billion US dollars and 2
heard the same,
billion
yeah.
US dollars were swaps at that time.
Yeah, the same. And but I don't know what,
you may
what they
have
did
heard,
and didn't
but we
have
know
access
this
to.
was, because this was what the finance minister Ali Sabri, who came on our shows, told us. There was
Yeah.
only 20 million US dollars. 20 million US dollars. I think all the private sectors get together have more than 20 million US dollars in their profitability, because at that time the export companies were reached out by the governor of the central bank to lend them money, and as a result of that, most of the private export companies got together and started giving money to the government to bring in fuel to the country.
Right. But so the point is really, how did we get to that point where we were so desperate that there were no other options and the default was supposedly necessary? And that's where I'm pointing to two things. One is I'm saying there was excessive borrowing of commercial debt that anyone involved should have known was never going to be repaid with the foreign exchange earning capabilities that Sri Lanka had at the time. So that was totally irresponsible in my view. Then the other is point to a country that has successfully avoided external debt problems that hasn't moved down the export-oriented industrialization line. You can't find them. They've all done that same thing. So for me, I do have that worry that exactly the same is going to happen in 3 years' time when the foreign debt payments start again, because in that sense, not much has changed. Now, maybe the government is going to make some radical changes this year and next year. Could be, but so far I'm not seeing the structural transformation that we saw in South Korea, in Taiwan, in China, in Vietnam, which prevented them from ever defaulting again. Whereas if we look at a lot of the African countries, like Ghana, that also went through a similar situation, it's the same problem. No industrialization, no industrial policies. And then we can point to the same old things, corruption and mistakes made here and there in terms of, what the timing was of default. But I'm saying those are the details where the much larger picture is really, are you industrializing or not? That's it, simple as that. And can you manage this foreign debt that, in my opinion, was messed up well before the government that actually had to default?
You mentioned President Ranasinghe Premadasa's industrialization, which, he was assassinated in 1993.
Yeah, 93.
So from 93 to today, nothing to speak of in industrialization?
Well, they even point to deindustrialization, some of the economists, when they look at the statistics. I'm not sure that that actually happened, but I would say the process was halted because a strong move was made into garments manufacturing, and we see that that is usually the first stage of industrialization, like with Vietnam. But then the second stage involves going higher up that value chain to more high technology goods, like electronics, machinery. And that's where Vietnam is moving to now, but Sri Lanka never did. And I think that would be the next stage,
So
where
that's
we
the
get a
next stage.
whole, we get a whole set of new industrial policies that incentivize foreign manufacturers in these industries, electronics, machinery, to come and set up production here. But at the same time, Sri Lankan manufacturers have to be able to learn from them and work with them to be able to themselves become internationally competitive, because just getting the foreign manufacturers here is not going to do a whole lot for Sri Lanka. It's going to do something because it's going to improve the foreign exchange earning capabilities.
Rohantha, I think he was less used in the program, I guess. Rohantha, now you were at one point the chairman of EDB and then the chairman of the tourism board as well. Now these are the two sectors where we need to bring more inflows to the country if we want to recover and avoid another default. And how do you see things are moving now?
See, like I said, Shan, right now it's organic growth that we see. So
there is no external inputs.
There has to be a change of direction, and I think the wake-up call was when from 6.8 million, your voter base came down to 4.3 million. It's a wake-up call for people to say that I need to put food on the table. I don't know whether you know, but as we speak right now, almost 10% of the people can't afford to buy full cream milk powder, even as at now. Only 45% of the people, their income can cover the expenditure for a given month. So, people, you can see the agitation happening already on media. You can see people are are voicing. So I think whilst all the economic principles are fantastic, now we need action on the ground, and that requires a strategic shift in the way that the tourism needs to be targeted. Rural tourism is one of the trending things right now. The current government has allocated 600 million to develop 100 villages, because then that's one way that the money will trickle down to the community. And what we see all over the world is that rural tourism gets you the $200-300 kind of value on a daily basis. I don't know whether you know, there is a project funded by the Australian government. It's a company called MDF, and they are doing a project in Kurunegala, just outskirts. They've taken 2 villages and they turned that totally into eco, and any traveler who comes in, their carbon footprint is neutral. So and what's up per day cost $250. So there are pockets of beautiful projects happening at the ground end, and now I think what the government needs to do is to take these case studies, move the strategic direction to move away from large buildings into this whole concept of new thinking that's happening around the world, get the money into the rural people and the semi-urban areas, so that then you can see that they will start putting food on the table. As we speak, as at now, you have like 8% of the population saying I can't buy a shampoo. I mean 37% people who were users before today are saying they can't buy a face wash. Now this may sound kind of it's a different perspective around this table, but for a brand marketing person, you see people moving out of categories and getting into new, saying that I can't afford. So now people are saying I want a change, and that change we can see that they are voicing it, and they have very clearly voiced it with a 6.8 to 4.3 million shift. So now the question is, we have to look at new things. I mean, if you look at the export basket, if you look at the overall export.
Rohantha, you can wrap up with this, your thoughts on the final. I will give you another extra 2 minutes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What a concession. So, yes. No, I mean, so we know that there is an issue that needs to be addressed with strong leadership, and that leadership people are looking to see. And I hope on the 26th of June onwards, all of us can support this new yardstick happening on the tourism front, and maybe we can look at new segments that will be brought into the country so that your income can keep on increasing rather than the $167 that we currently get. And of course, there is nothing called off season, so we have to make that shift. And if that doesn't happen, I think what the discussion happening on the 2028 will happen much more closer. If you look at the export front, 61% of the business currently in the export basket is coming from 2 sectors, which happens to be the EU and North America. Now, what are those markets growing at? 3 to 6%. But then you have 2 large segments, which is the Africa and the South Asian segment, which is growing at about 30% as we speak in the first 4 months, growing at that kind of rate, but their contribution to the basket is just 3 to 4%. So, I mean, Shamir knows this from a business point of view. You will focus on the Africa and the South Asia where there is opportunity, but then the question is, do we have a consulate which has an economic officer there? If you look at the African region, I mean, you have only just 3 embassies and all that, there is only 1 officer. So how do you expect to drive the African industry?
No, that's a very good question, Rohantha, because in Iraq, we don't have an ambassador. That's one of the biggest tea drinking nations in the world.
Yeah. So
there is no trade officer, there is no council, nothing.
So Shamir, I mean, what the examples you're citing is ground based. So what I'm saying is, if you are not going to see this shift in the next 3 to 6 months, the game is lost. Game is lost. And if you look at currently, even if you take the FTA, I mean, what are we exporting? Animal feed, pepper, you know, the 8 million pieces of apparel is now going through. But then what the Indian government is saying is, if you sign ICTA, we will give you 32 million. I'm not advocating that we sign ICTA, I'm saying get to the discussion. Because if we don't see those kinds of conversations happening, how can you make South Asia, which is growing at 30% on an export basket, you know, how do we make sure that this contributes to about 40% of it?
We just heard that one of the big apparel industries, apparel company in Sri Lanka is almost on the verge of bankruptcy. They just a couple of years ago announced an IPO, and today they are in shambles.
So, Shamil, my point, what I'm saying is, I'm giving you data from a consumer point of view, I'm giving you data from an export point of view, I'm giving you data from a tourism perspective, and I think now 7 months have gone, and you know, if this direction is not happening and we are not going to support this, I mean, we also have a responsibility to sit and give that support, and if we don't do that, I mean, the country, you know, will be part of another book in economics. Thank you.
We are trying to do that support by having a public discourse always, Rohantha. I hope the government takes it constructively. Anushan, your final thoughts.
Yes. So we were earlier talking about the economic issues of the crisis and how people went through so much of difficulty. But while I said like earlier, some numbers of growth have improved and we've had debt to GDP coming down and revenues going up, we also still see lots of factors, other indicators, like the indicators which really impact the citizens. So which is things like the number of people employed. So one is the number of people employed as a percentage of the working age. So that means out of the working age, the number of people who are employed is at the 20-year low. It hit the 20-year low in last year, 2024. So it reached to 45.3%. It was at its highest in 2018 when it was around 51.8%. So people are actually losing jobs despite the growth that was there last year. Every year people are losing, and since the crisis 300,000 people have lost their jobs. So what we really need to see is like all these growths, is it really translating into jobs and other indicators where people can get their well-being improved. And we also see, as Rohantha was saying earlier, like people can't afford stuff and their real incomes have actually reduced because the inflation has increased much higher by much higher levels and people's incomes have not gone up. So those are things like it's still haunting us, and we see poverty also has gone up to about 20%, and all of those things are still there. So those are things that I think requires like some targeted attention of the government, so just not focusing on growth as a whole in terms of just the GDP number, but also looking at these things and how different people are impacted by these things.
2.3 million, the poverty line has gone up to around 7.5 million to 8 million right now. Anushan, that's a big number. It's a stark jump in terms of the poverty levels as well.
Yeah, so in terms of the poverty levels, actually one of the interesting things is that we don't even have like official government number on that, because all these numbers that are reported are by like World Bank or like other institutions who are reporting. Yeah. The government last did a HIS survey, the Household Income Expenditure Survey in 2019, and up to now they're only doing one now,
but
and they've not released any results.
Program really capitalizing on that number, or capturing that number?
So Aswasama program is based on certain criteria, and they say based on these criteria, these people are the poor, and that captures around 20 or 21% the number of people. But like, there's no official record of the poverty number, the number of people poverty here. But also in terms of growth, so in order to not lead to this crisis, because it has huge impacts on the citizen, and not to lead to this growth into this default again is very important. And for that, I think one is that we need to stop the debt growing, which we are in the right path now because we've controlled the fiscal balances and all. The next is actually growing your GDP. So you can increase your GDP and reduce your debt as a share of GDP. So improving that is also important, and for that is why the growth is important. And growth can actually come from many ways actually. So Dhananath was saying about corruptions, so those are also really important to fix the issues. And again, export manufacturing and improving exports is again important. But then you also need to invest on health, education, and also need to have connectivity and infrastructure set in a place where the private sector should lead the growth, but the government should be supporting wherever possible for the private sector to improve their growth. So growth is really essential, and there's lots of still structural issues which we have not fixed, and we need to really focus more on the growth aspect of things and improve the growth, but not just limit to growth, but also look at how it affects people, some of the people in the ground, whether it's improving your incomes are real incomes are increasing or your jobs are growing. Those are also indicators that you need to look.
Right. Thanks a lot, Anushan, lead economist of Data Research. I now move attention to Dr. Brahm Nicholas.
I wasn't sure how to end it, but Rohantha, you actually got me thinking about a very interesting statistic that I once read. Is Singapore actually also had a EDB, I'm sure you're or still has, except for them it's called, I think, the Economic Development Board. Yeah. But their function is very much the same as the Sri Lankan EDB, and has always been since they were set up in the early 1960s, I believe. The difference is they were incredibly well funded from the start, and if we compare to how well funded the EDB is now, or how poorly I should say, relative to the size of the economy, we can see that the EDB of Singapore at the time of industrialization was 100 times greater relative to the size of their economy. 100 times better funded than the EDB is now. I think this is the problem that we're facing, is that there is not enough funding for these key institutions that should be driving the industrialization process. And until that is addressed, I don't think that, actually I know, because it has never happened before in history without the government driving this through policy and through institutions, that Sri Lanka can move down this industrialization line. So I would say one of the first things that needs to happen is money needs to be found for a better funded EDB that starts also building connections in these new markets that Rohantha, you were also talking about, I think, where indeed we shouldn't just be focusing on the US and EU, because we see now where it leads us is in this tariff war. It's been an absolute disaster. And this is after the fact that we already knew that that East Asia and a lot of other Asian countries are actually growing faster. But you need the Sri Lankan government institutions to also be able to push that and help Sri Lankan companies enter those markets. If there isn't proper funding for these institutions, I think Sri Lanka is dead in the water.
Thanks a lot, Brahm. Dhananath.
Shamir, my final few minutes I would like to stand for few things that I would not compromise. And one, I'm okay with not reforming state-owned enterprises, I'm okay with anything. But on money printing, I take a very hard stance. Because I show it with the data. The money printing started in 2021 June, and inflation went up to 76%. And even while central bank has done a commendable job now, I even go to the extent that they let people die in hunger by making a mockery out of it. And there's a Supreme Court judgment. Even I recommend there has to be a white flag in front of central bank to remind them the chaos that they created by printing money and preaching that money printing doesn't cause inflation. I wish all the well, I mean it very sincerely. I wish all the well to Brahm. Even I wish him to win the Nobel Prize by proving that money printing has no correlation with inflation.
Well, it's very simple. That's actually not money printing.
I'll come
because
to that.
there should be bank printing
So
as
I
well.
take a very hard stance on that because it wiped out, it improved the, increased the poverty from 3 million people to 7 million. This is no joke. People died out of hunger. So on money printing, I take a very hard stance, and that's non-negotiable. You can win the Nobel Prize, but till then, don't go in that direction. We will be definitely going to chaos again, guaranteed. Number two, we are all for industrialization. I think no one says no for more exports. I mean, no one says, but the problem lies on building that ecosystem. And that comes on trade, and that comes from other reforms on labor, on land, on industrial parks, and allowing moving foreign direct investment and capital flow. So that has to be there. Otherwise, this is, we really do not have a way out from this crisis. The third, on trade, we cannot look at in isolation. We have to look at what are the trade policies done by India and other parts of the world, and we have to strategically move on with the policies that is taking in the global context as well. Definitely the state-owned enterprises has to move, but without those reforms, we are at the moment, there's people had higher hope on a takeoff. I think still that hope is there. But if we reverse on the policies, that we will drift, and if we do not, if we continue to drift, it will be a relapse, and we are already in the risk zone of a second default. And reforms is the only answer, but I would like to again reiterate, inflation is always a monetary phenomenon. Until you prove it wrong, don't go in that direction, because we had a bitter taste on the policy, and there's a Supreme Court judgment, and I think I can rest my case from there.
Thanks a lot, Dhananath Fernando, CEO of Advocat Institute, Dr. Brahm Nicholas, economist, Anushan Kapilan, lead economist of the Verity Research Organization, as well as Dr. Rohantha Athukorala, Vice Chairman of the World's Rural Tourism Council. Again, I want to leave the four of you saying we respect the opinion of all four of you, and you are entitled for your own thoughts and remarks on this very show. And that is why Shihar and Niresh and I, we try to get the best out of you to make sure that the public can weigh the pros and cons of your statements and let them decide as to what is right and what is for the best of the country. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation. I leave you tonight with a quote as I always do, but very quickly, Dhananath, you're not confused anymore, right?
Not anymore.
After 2 hours, if Dhananath says that he's confused, I'll be very surprised. And I don't want to let him go with a confused heart. So I leave you tonight with the quote as I always do. Economics is like gravity, ignore it and you will be in for some rude surprises. We definitely don't want to be there. Take care and good night.